Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. We'll get started shortly. Thanks so much for tuning in to Justice Now from the National Urban League. We really look forward to having this conversation. Come on in. Come on in. We look forward to speaking with all of you this evening. Thanks so much for joining us tonight. We are looking forward to celebrating Pride Month. Good evening. Thanks for joining us. Happy Pride Month, everyone. Just looking for our guest this evening. It's going to be a great conversation. Thanks for joining us, everyone.
Hello.
Hi, how are you, Alfonso?
I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm doing well. We will get started shortly. I'm just waiting for David to join us, but we're really looking forward to this conversation and appreciate you so much for being with us. One moment.
Oh, you're very welcome. Very welcome. Okay.
Okay. So how have you been celebrating Pride so far?
So, as you know, we've been focused on defeating anti-LGBTQ legislation that has been introduced in the states. Bills that have been introduced in state legislatures across the country. 24 of them have been signed into law. And so as people celebrate Pride, we want to make sure that they are grounded in our activism. So we've been focused on that. And here we have Mr. Johns.
Hey, brother. Good to see you
Great.
again.
You too.
Hi, how are you, David? Good to see you.
I'm doing well. I'm hoping that the connection gives us Babyface and not Teddy Riley. I'm in a hotel. I don't know how stable it'll be. But thankful for you all making space and to share space with my brother, Alfonso David.
Awesome. Well, good evening to everyone that's joined us. I'm Jerika Richardson, Senior Vice President for Equitable Justice and Strategic Initiatives at the National Urban League. And so I'm really excited about this week's Justice Now conversation. We are celebrating Pride Month with a lens on layered oppression that the LGBTQ plus Black and Brown communities face in the collective fight for justice. And so I just want to introduce you all. We've already started chatting, but today I am joined by Alfonso David, an accomplished, nationally recognized LGBTQ plus civil rights lawyer and advocate. Mr. David now serves as the president of the Human Rights Campaign. And I'm also joined by David Johns, a recognized thought leader and social justice champion. Mr. Johns is currently executive director of the National Black Justice Coalition. So welcome to you both.
Thank you again.
Thank you.
And so I just want to encourage folks that have joined us to feel free to drop messages or questions in the chat. We'd love for this to be an interactive conversation. And I'll just start off by saying we are in the midst of an incredible moment in social justice, really centered on equity in this country. And both of your organizations have been really on the front lines of this fight. I think it's important that we're always thinking about teachable moments, and just wanted to know if you each can just give us a minute or two briefly about your organizations. Alfonso, can you start? We'll start with you and share a little bit about your organization and the work that you all are doing.
Sure. So the Human Rights Campaign is the largest LGBTQ civil rights organization in the country and around the globe. It was founded in 1980. In large part because LGBTQ people did not have political representation. And the organization started focusing on how we can identify candidates to run for political office and also support the community, pro-equality candidates to support the community. The work expanded beyond the political sphere into programmatic work that the organization does now as well. We have more than 11 different programs that provide services and resources to LGBTQ people, from what we say from the cradle to the grave, where we have aging programs, we have programs that provide resources for people with HIV, we have corporate equality index where we engage with companies all across the country and in fact around the globe. And in addition to those two major pillars, we also do a fair amount of education and outreach work all across the country and in fact around the globe. Our goal, our ultimate goal, is to achieve equality and liberation for LGBTQ people.
Well, that's a really important goal, and I'm just so happy that you all have really been engaging in outreach, because it's so important to where we are right now. David, do you want to share a little bit about your organization before we jump right in?
Yeah, happy to do that. For those who don't know, the National Black Justice Coalition is honored to be in the arena with our friends at HRC. We are the nation's only civil rights organization that has always been at the intersections of racial equity and LGBTQIA+ equality. So in addition to showing up and being disruptive in progressive LGBTQIA+ spaces, we also show up in legacy civil rights spaces with Black folks to remind members of our community that as long as we have existed as Black people, we have been beautifully and incredibly diverse. And that none of us are free unless and until all of us are free. And so a lot of our work focuses on federal public policy. I'm honored to be in the work with Alfonso David, and HRC around trying to pass the Equality Act. Also pushing against the spate of anti-trans legislation that we've seen this year in particular. We also do a lot of work around the disproportionate murders of Black trans women. We spend a lot of time talking about mental health and other forms of well-being for our community. And given my experience as an elementary school educator, we also do a lot of work with K-12 educators and education systems to ensure that they make space for our babies. Fun fact, students who are members of the LGBTQIA+ community or who are perceived to be members of the LGBTQIA+ community in public schools around the country right now do not have the same protections as their peers. And acknowledging that children don't ask to be born, there's a whole lot of more work to be done in that space. So that's a little of how we show up in the world.
Well, thank you for that. I think you touched on a whole host of issues that we really want to dive into in this conversation. But let me start out by taking a step back. I think when we're talking about Pride and Pride Month, we hear origin stories of this movement in this country. And more often than not, I don't think that there is really a recognition or that it is that we see the Black community and the brown community represented as much in that storytelling. So we hear about Stonewall, and I just want to open the floor up to hear from you all about really what's the origins of the Black and brown community within the LGBTQ plus IA plus community. Forgive me.
No, you good. Work through it. It's a lot of letters. We're going to keep adding until we don't need any of them.
David, why don't you get us started? Because I think there's a lot of education that needs to go on, and oftentimes the face of this community has been white gay men, and we know it's much broader than that. And we know our community, people of color, have been engaged in that fight from the very beginning.
Yes, one of the reasons why I'm thankful that my brother's in this work. And I want to also lift up our sisters, Kiara Johnson, who leads the National LGBTQ Task Force, and Imani Rupert Gordon, who leads NCLR, the National Center on Lesbian Rights. National organizations that have always shown up in this space, but that have not always been led by Black people, not just people of color. And I say that to acknowledge that even when we haven't had the titles or the roles formally, we have lived on the front lines of efforts to ensure that people could get close to being free, are living life with the opportunity to pursue happiness and otherwise know some semblance of justice. And I won't talk as much in this moment about Stonewall and Marsha P. Johnson or Sylvia Rivera, but I will offer up two things that I think are frequently missed when people have pride conversations, especially in Black spaces. One is that 10 years before, correct me on the math, brother, if I'm wrong, but 10 years before the riot at Stonewall, which led to Pride in New York, there was a riot, a righteous riot at a donut shop called Cooper's Donuts in Compton, California, which is closer to where I'm from in Inglewood, California. And the thing that I want to make clear is that both in New York and in Compton, there were laws that permitted discrimination. Why anyone ever needed to show an ID at a donut shop will always be beyond me, but it was permitted that shop owners could deny service to people whose gender expression was not consistent with that on their identification. I still don't even know why my gender is on my identification now, but that's a whole nother conversation. But all this to say that the normalization of discrimination has always been a problem that has not only affected Black folks, but Black queer folks. And for those of us that show up with intersectional identities, it's often challenging for me to identify why somebody's discriminated against me in a moment of discrimination. The second thing I'll say is that too often pride stories are divorced from stories of the civil rights movement, such that folks like Byron Rustin, who was the architect of the modern civil rights march on Washington, are erased. And even if we just step back now and appreciate that in this moment, in this movement for Black lives, so many of the leaders of organizations throughout the country are Black, queer, trans, non-binary folk. It's a reminder, it should be a testament to all of us that we've always been here, even when we haven't been acknowledged or other people didn't want to recognize the labor.
So true. I mean, Bayard Rustin really was pivotal in the civil rights movement. I mean, he was one of the folks that brought it all together. And I think this is important for us to continue to have conversations like this, to tell the stories that unfortunately have not been told or have been whitewashed, even in communities of color. So Alfonso, I would love for you to weigh in on this and just share any nuggets on, the historical significance of pride, but really the contributions of people from communities of color.
David is exactly right. When we talk about pride and when we see pictures, historical pictures of pride, it has not always included us. And to David's point, the movement as we know it, the LGBTQ civil rights movement as we know it, was started by Black and brown folks. Compton's Cafeteria, Cooper's Donuts, Stonewall, all Black and brown folks, and largely trans and non-binary folks. That's the other part of the narrative that we sometimes forget. The movement as we know it today was founded by transgender and non-binary people, period, that were Black and brown. And both our gender identity as well as our race were effectively removed and erased from the history books. When we talk about the movement as we know it today and how it was built in some cases excluding people of color, excluding transgender people, excluding non-binary people. And as we think about pride, I want to make sure we revisit our activism, but we do it historically accurate. We have to make sure that the information that is being reflected in our history books is actually comprehensive, that it's not only telling a part of the story, but it's telling the accurate story. And that's what I think pride is about, right? Pride, yes, is about celebrating our identity, but it's about refocusing our activism to make sure that we are doing the necessary work that we need to do to advance equality for all. I think of this as it relates to the work that we do today. I often say that the focus of my work is really identifying and targeting the priorities of people who are multiply marginalized. And I say that because there's a common through line. The common through line is our identity, and we're being treated differently because of who we are. If we focus on those who are multiply marginalized, we can actually get to the cancer of indifference. And that cancer we've seen repeat over and over again. Doesn't matter what the identified group is. We just know the status quo is interested in further oppressing minority populations. And LGBTQ people and LGBTQ Black people are no different.
I mean, this collective movement that we're speaking of, I think really came to the forefront when we look at 2020 and we saw the tragic death of George Floyd. It seemed like there was an awakening in this country and people were really speaking up and speaking out. And I think one of the things that really came to the forefront during those conversations around social justice and Black Lives Matter was the phrase, all Black Lives Matter. Alfonso, can you tell us a little bit about what that means to you and what that means to the broader community?
Look, if I'm going to be attacked by a police officer, the officer is not asking me whether or not I'm LGBTQ. Just so we're clear.
Yeah.
Yes, there are instances where I'm being attacked because of my sexual orientation. But when we're talking about racial discrimination, our orientations, our gender identity, in some cases are secondary. And when we think about Black lives, we have to make sure we, as Black people, are assigning value to all of our lives, not just to some of our lives. Because if we don't do that, we're further subjugating ourselves, right? If we say that's not really my issue, then you're effectively saying that you are acquiescing when the transgender person is murdered on the street. So we have a moral responsibility to make sure that when we defend the civil rights of Black people, we're defending the civil rights of all Black people, not just some Black people. And I think, you know, what we've seen over the past year is an appropriate amplification of police violence against Black lives. But what we have not seen as much is the amplification of the violence against transgender people. We had at least 44 transgender people killed last year. This year, at least 29. It's not on the front pages of the newspaper.
Yeah.
So we all have a moral responsibility to really make sure we're engaging in that conversation and educating all members of our community.
I totally agree. I think one of the things that I've learned in my work in police oversight is that it is not really brought to the forefront. So definitely we are seeing the rise in deaths in the trans community, and it is not making the headlines in the same way it would if another group was experiencing that type of persecution. And there's so much that we absolutely must do. And we're thinking about policing. There has been this emphasis around race and people of color and Black and brown communities when it comes to police misconduct. But one of the things that I think in my prior work at the Civilian Complaint Review Board, we felt it was extremely important to do was lift up the atrocities that we are seeing and the targeting that we are seeing from the trans community as it relates to the Black trans community, because there is this intersectionality of both race, color, and gender identity that unfortunately, I think, has emboldened some members of law enforcement and others, because there's this perception that folks won't care, that people won't pay attention. And so it's almost created, a really exacerbated situation where these things are happening and there isn't the same level of accountability. Quite frankly, the level of accountability that we're not seeking in the Black community, but it's even twice that when we are talking about the trans community. And so, David, I know you raised this earlier, and is there more that you want to elaborate on this topic? And also, is there anything that you can tell, our viewers today about how they can really engage and lift up this work and bring more attention to, I think, a really problematic issue that's happening in our country.
Yeah, I want to double down on everything that both you and Alfonso said and lift up that the same week that George Floyd was murdered, Tony McDade, a Black trans man, was murdered in Tallahassee by the Tallahassee Police Department. And I find myself wanting to say that every time someone lifts up the name of Brother George Floyd, not because they should not, but because when we recite the scroll of stolen lives, it should include all of us. And still to this day, that's not our reality. And if it weren't for the fact that HRC and or NBJC shares news about stolen lives of Black trans women in particular, I don't know that we would even have the record. And I say this acknowledging that last year we lost Monica Roberts, the trans griot, who introduced to us the importance of keeping that record. And so what I would say to the community is that any efforts to advance civil rights for Black folks have to advance opportunities for all Black folks and for all of us, for all parts of us. It is disingenuous at best to say that we support Black people and then pick and choose amongst us who it is that we want to support or otherwise think should have access to live in the ways that many of us take for granted and otherwise know are incredibly important. Finding ways to support our organizations is always helpful. Calling now to ensure that your senators are putting pressure on the Republican caucus to pass the Equality Act is more than meaningful. And again, I say that because there are some folks who might watch this at some point and think that I don't need to care about that because it's you know, it's for the gays, it's for them. This bill fills a critically important foundational gap in the Civil Rights Act of '64 and the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990 that will benefit Black women. Thinking about a lot of the conversations we've had around advancing the Crown Act to ensure that sisters like you can't be fired for wearing your hair whatever way you want to, in ways that a white woman will try and steal and profit from. It'll benefit other women on the basis of sex. We know what affirmative action has done for white women, ... heretofore. And so I say all of that to say that we should be clear that when we find ways to support what my Black Baptist grandfather would say are the least of us, or the least of these, then we all win. And of course, when I say we in this context, I'm talking explicitly about Black people.
It definitely is a collective effort. And I think one of the things that we also saw in this past year is great turnout when it comes to all of our communities and really showing up at the ballot box. But I would love to hear more from the two of you about the importance of civic engagement and the LGBTQ IA+'s community is involvement. And I mean, some of the historic gains that we have seen. I'll say, you know, Alfonso, I just point to you. You are the first person that has a civil rights background and the first Black man that is leading the human rights campaign. I think there's been so many, I think, monumental gains across the country, both in the civic engagement and the nonprofit space. And so I think it's really important to lift up that work and tell those stories. And so, Alfonso, if you could share a little bit with the folks that are here about those gains and how you think civic engagement really comes into play when we're pushing and really advocating for some of the important policies that David already laid out.
Yeah, I would say that we were on the cusp of losing our democracy this past cycle. It was very real. We had the President of the United States seeking to really undermine the pillars of our democracy. And we only won this election because we engaged. Black and brown people, women, all across this country use their power and their voices to make sure that the elected officials that are going to represent all of our interests. And that's really key. I mean, I'm representing, you know, a shirt here, Volta Warnock. Went to Georgia to support Warnock and support Ossoff. When people told us we couldn't win Georgia, we did. When people told us we couldn't beat Trump, we did. And I frame it that way is because it's important for us to think about our capacity. We are going to be facing another election in a year and a half, the midterms. And if we're not as focused on engaging all of our communities and breaking down those barriers to use our voices at the ballot box, we could lose the Senate. And this is very real because right now we have hundreds of bills that have been introduced in state legislatures around the country to suppress our right to vote. They're looking to make it more difficult for people of color to vote. Why do you think that is? Because they're looking to collectively hold on to power. And we have to be the ones using our collective power, our capacity, to make sure that we communicate to them that we're not going to go away with our fight. We're going to make sure that we win back our democracy. I've had the unfortunate experience of living in a country where we lost our democracy. It's possible anywhere. And I want to make sure that people appreciate that and engage. Your right to vote is constitutional. Many people around the world don't have the same rights. And so we should take advantage of this right and make sure that we have elected officials elected to office to represent our interests.
So true. I mean, we really are at a critical crossroads in this country. And we saw that. We saw it with at the top of the year with the insurrection. We see it with all the suppressive voting rights laws that are popping up across the country. I mean, it is a fight that we all need to recognize that impacts many communities. And we really, really need to engage. I do want to go back to the Equality Act. And David, I think if you could speak a little bit more to it. You know, we've gotten questions about where it is, why is it stalled? If so, why is it stalled? And what do we really need to do to move this forward?
If you're okay, I'm going to defer this to my good brother. We are part of a coalition that he is leading. We're happy to be a part of it, but I would love for him to answer this question.
Absolutely. Thank you, David. The Equality Act is federal legislation that would amend the 1964 Civil Rights Act to protect LGBTQ people from discrimination. So in 1964, the Civil Rights Act was passed, and it prohibited discrimination on a variety of bases, but certainly on the basis of race. The Civil Rights Act did not include sexual orientation, did not include gender identity. And so we're looking to amend the law to make sure that LGBTQ people are protected. What many people don't know is that the Civil Rights Act of 1964 didn't include certain protections that we take for granted today. So any of us on this call could walk into a retail store, depending on your preferences, Gap or Saks Fifth Avenue or Gucci, whatever you like. And you could walk into a department store and face discrimination as a Black person, and you would have no protections under federal law. The Equality Act changes that. Women are not protected under public accommodations. The Equality Act would change that. Any of us could try to serve on a jury, and we could be dismissed because of our sexual orientation. We would have absolutely no recourse under federal law. So we need to make sure that we pass this bill so that LGBTQ people can be protected. I could get on a plane leaving New York or DC and travel to another city, get into an Uber or into a Lyft and face discrimination as an LGBTQ person, and I would have no recourse under federal law. So the bill has passed the House of Representatives and is currently pending in the US Senate, and we need everyone to contact their senators. 472-472, use your phone, call 472-472. You will be connected to your senator and communicate to them why it's important for them to support the Equality Act.
Well, thank you for that. And if you wouldn't mind, Alfonso, just dropping that 472-472 in the chat, because I think there are a lot of folks that really want to engage. Oh, you got it? Okay. Thank you so much. Teamwork makes the dream work, so I appreciate you.
David knows I'm technologically challenged. He knows.
You know, David, I just wanted to lift up education because I know you've done incredible work in the Obama administration around that. I also know that you are a graduate of an HBCU like myself. I went to Spelman
so no,
College,
you about to get me in trouble. No, you got to get me in trouble. You're going to get me in trouble. I did a domestic exchange at Howard.
I'm on the
admissions,
let me not start
admissions brochure. I have friends who are Bisons, and I'm connected to
Okay.
fam rattlers, but I graduated from Columbia. I'm a PWI baby. Don't get me in trouble, sis.
Okay, okay. So you're around the corner from me. You went to school around the corner from me. I'm up
That,
here in Harlem. So let me not get you in trouble. But
please.
Columbia education or an HBCU education, all of them are so critical to our community. And we're engaged in
Yeah,
this whole conversation around history and telling our stories and telling the stories of marginalized communities to really make sure that our history books are reflective of the truth. We are really going through this period of truth and reconciliation right now. And I
yeah,
think one of the issues that keep popping up is critical race theory. And I think it's important that we're having these conversations. So if you could just lift up for us or share some sentiments around education as it applies to communities of color, but also communities of color that live within the LGBTQIA plus community. What's the stories? What should we be sharing here?
yeah. I think three things come to mind. One is that the first person to use the term, to tweet the term Black Lives Matter, is a Black same gender loving man, Dr. Marcus Anthony Hunter, who's a professor at UCLA. He's a sociologist who taught high school in Philadelphia, and he shows up in the legacy of so many members of our community who understand that the opportunity to connect the sacrifices that our ancestors have made to the promise and potential of the future is often done through education. I think about as I share his story that the people who popularized the term Black Lives Matter as it is connected to the movement are three Black women, two of whom are queer, and each of whom show up as educators in the way in which they do their work, both formally and informally. And so I want to be clear that while we still have a lot of work to do in this country to ensure that public systems of education find ways to deal with white supremacy such that Black children are not traumatized intentionally, there are opportunities for us as a community to share stories, to fill gaps, to educate our babies in ways that will allow them to show up in our public schools and not just survive, but to thrive. I also want to lift up, very much connected to the conversation we were just having about the rights that too many people still take for granted. Neka Olamoru has a film that's on HBO right now called Legends of the Underground, which really talks about the experiences of Black LGBTQIA plus folks in Nigeria. And I really want to encourage everyone who has the chance to consume this conversation to watch it. Not only is it for me a powerful reminder that we are all connected as descendants of the diaspora, but that there are still so many efforts required to ensure that we can show up in spaces where we can just be safe and just be. Again, I think that the thing that for me is most important about the Equality Act is that too many times people take for granted that walking out of a home for a Black LGBTQIA plus person invites trauma. You're offering up yourself to all kinds of possible abuse or violence. And if we can pass policy to minimize that, while as a community of Black folks increasing competence and compassion and adopting pronouns or otherwise being more respectful, then we can make it easier for members of our community to just be.
Well, thank you for that. We are nearing the end of our time, but I really want to just be able to leave everyone that's joining us today with a few thoughts from both of you. How do we continue this conversation? How do we continue this advocacy and this work beyond Pride Month? Because we know how folks are very inclined to relegate marginalized communities to a month. And I don't know about you, but I'm Black 365 days of the year. And
Black
I
and
think
queer.
So it is important. It is important that we have these conversations and that it's just not a hashtag. It's just not nuance. It's not just something that we just celebrate when the time comes. And so want to hear your thoughts on that and any other parting words that you want to leave folks with today. Alfonso, do you want to go first?
Sure. I would say I'm in the business of culture change. That's what I think civil rights is. And I often ask people to find our collective humanity. How is it that you can look at the person that sits next to you who looks nothing like you and find their humanity? As Black people, we have to do the same thing, because we have, in some cases, devalued members of our own community. So yes, we're celebrating LGBTQ Pride Month, but find a way to see beyond yourself. Find a way to see beyond the policy issue that directly affects you. Find a way to take action, engage, volunteer, support, however you think is appropriate for your life. But ultimately, if we're going to get to that place that we call equality or liberation, and we're not seeing beyond ourselves, it's not going to be sustainable. The 1964 Civil Rights Act was passed in 1964, and yet Black people are still being killed on the streets of this country. So it's not only in the laws and the policies that we're passing. It's about making sure that we create a community that is global, that is inclusive of all of us. And we don't just do that for Pride Month. We do that year round.
Really powerful. I think you really underscored for us how important it is to put the focus on our humanity. I mean, so many folks in this country really have been marginalized. And if we are looking at the Black community, we were once considered 3/5 of a person. And then to layer on the discrimination and oppression that our brothers and sisters in the LGBTQIA plus community face is just a lot. And so thanks for lifting that up. And David, I'll go to you. Is there anything you want to share before we wrap our conversation this evening?
Yeah, at the risk of being persnickety, what I know as a member of the Urban League is that if there's one thing that exists, it's capacity to do exactly what was just described, right? Every Urban League that I know of is committed to the business of ensuring that Black folks have the resources required to ensure that we can not just survive, but thrive. And so my ask to members of our community, this Urban League family, is to do the work to create more space for members of our community who have intersectional identities. And in this moment, I'm not just talking about LGBTQIA plus same-gender loving people. I'm talking about those of us with disabilities, those of us for whom our parents are not from this country, right? Those of us who might be members of religious minority communities. Finding ways to, again, increase competence and compassion to make more space for more Black people to be free is how I think that we win. And I know that there are some folks who might feel like this is not their fight, or that their religious teachings can't allow them to wrap their heads around this. And what I'll say is that I've read, the Jesus that I know showed up for the least of these. And if you're going to show up to love on Black folks, show up to love on all of us. And if you don't want to do it for me as a grown-ass man, do it for our babies who didn't ask to be born, who are identifying more often as anything other than strictly heterosexual, not because there's a gay agenda, but because they realize that these binaries, these boxes, are tools of white supremacy. And that if we find ways to dismantle them, then again, we can all be free. And as I understand it, that's the goal.
Well said. I mean, that is one of the things that it's really important to do as members of the diaspora. We all have many layered identities, and we all need to be in a space where we recognize each and every one of us and make sure that we're creating a more inclusive space. You know, I'm really happy to even have the opportunity to be at the League right now, and to be, developing our equitable justice team. I mean, it is really time to look at all the intersectionalities and to lift this up. So that's the God I know, the Jesus I know too. And so we are going to continue to do the work. And just a reminder to everyone that has tuned in, it's 472, correct, Alfonso, that they can text to lift up the Equality Act. We have to get this through the Senate, and we need to continue to push on all of our elected officials. And I quite frankly feel if there's a reason we went to the polls, there's a reason we brought our protests there. We wanted a change in policies, and we really need to continue to push and turn that into power. And if folks are not showing up for the communities that put them there, then we need to vote them out. So thank
Agreed.
you all for joining us. It was a pleasure. Alfonso David, thank you so much. You all have been great friends and members of this movement, this Urban League movement, and just the movement for all Black lives. And so just thank you for all of your contributions, and thanks to everyone for joining us. Remember, the time for justice is always now. Take care.
Thank you. Thank you for your leadership.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you for having me.
Bye-bye. Take care.